Uh-oh. I wasn't going to say anything. Well, that's interesting. I don't know what that does. Okay, let me get started here with the only caveat that the microphone appears to be missing. Yes! Who put it over there? That's not where that goes.
It wasn't me.
I didn't think it was. Students stealing microphone. No, I'm kidding. Probably the last professor who forgot and then came back in and was like, ugh, I don't want to walk all the way back to the desk. Sweet. All right, is the battery charged this time? Okay, well, all problems are solved. Whew. Thought I was going to have to talk really loud, which I can do. All righty. Ooh, light's too bright. Let's dim those down a little bit. All righty. Yes, quite the turnout. Always this way on a class that's live streamed and recorded. The day before reading week, for some reason, fewer people show up. I don't know why. You know, already departed on your Mexican vacation, I guess. Okay, so what are we doing? I don't know. No, someone tell me. No, I'm kidding. All right, so we were talking last time about families, right? So we started our unit on families. And we're talking about marriage. Still working on exams. We'll get them back to you sometime during reading week. I'm so sorry. It's been crazy, but I will have time to get it done. I'm close. I'm not far away, but I never release anything before everything's done. So hopefully very early next week or this weekend if I have time. Okay. So we were talking about marriage last time, right? And we specifically went through a couple of the points that Rigneris makes in his book, The Future of Christian Marriage, about what's happened to marriage and specifically the shift in marriage, you know, from some of our older generations like our boomers and silents, where marriage was the foundation of adult life, to it having become the capstone of life, right? Something that you build towards, but that is sort of the reward or the decoration on an already completed life, right? And we ended off, I think here, with these quotes, right? We get ourselves ready for marriage rather than married to get ourselves poised to achieve things, right? And it's a capstone to a successful young adulthood, and basically designed for two adults who are fully independent. They don't need each other. They just want each other, right? Okay. Is my mic? Oh, you know what? Thank you. You know what I did? Is because I forgot my mic last time, I have the wrong mic enabled. That should be better. Ta-da. I'll turn that down a little bit. There we go. Okay. Thank you for pointing that out. All right. So, the case that Rigneris makes in this book, and I think is largely correct, is, and we'll see this too in Melissa Kearney's book, which is at the end of this unit, right? So we'll get to it after reading week, which is the two-parent privilege. I was going to say the two-parent trap, but that's not it. The two-parent privilege, right? Where she talks about this in a lot of ways as well. Marriage has changed, right, from, I'm going to highlight some stuff, a populist institution, right? One that was shared broadly by most people in the population, to a luxury institution, right? So it increasingly is the purview of the middle class and upper classes, right? Socioeconomically. It is no longer as widely shared. Okay. It serves primarily the ones who have made it, right? So you're doing well, you're college or university educated, you're middle class, you have good careers, right? You yourselves come from good families and these sorts of things, right? Owning a home, a car, or having some savings becomes a way to cross a symbolic line or boundary and qualify for marriage, right? So to even, and here we'll introduce this term, to even be marriageable, right? To be marriage material in contemporary culture is to already have some kind of material wealth and material status already built in, right? You have to have already kind of crossed that line in most cases to be marriageable, right? If you haven't, you're not even considered marriage material, right? Most people still want to marry, however, but only some people can actually afford it. Okay? So, it is something that is, increasingly you have to hit things like home ownership, car ownership, right? Some savings, definitely a good career, right? He doesn't have that in there, but I think definitely a good career is essential, right? In order to even be considered marriage material. Okay. Marriage, but not cohabitation, right? So you can live with someone without meeting these boundaries, right? So, but not cohabitation requires economic and residential independence, right? Which boils down to having enough money, which usually boils down to having two things, education and a good career, right? So you have to kind of cross those boundaries. Okay, and I love this quote. Again, page 38, 39, there's lots on there and they're really interesting. There's like lots of like pullable quotes from it, but I love this, right? So we're seeing what? We're seeing growing inequality in the West, prompted in part by a marriage divide, the marital divide between rich and poor. The advantaged, oh, we need more colors. I just love highlighting. The advantaged consolidate their wealth and income by a marriage between two successful people, while the disadvantaged, I should have chosen another color, but it would be ridiculous, are left without even the help of each other, right? Okay. So what is he saying here? Really importantly, marriage, he is suggesting, when we talk about the growing income inequality and the growing gap between the rich and poor in contemporary society, is at least partially being driven by marriage rates, right? And the fact that when it comes to who is getting married, we'll talk about that as we go through, it's increasingly a middle class and upper class institution, and it serves those people very well. Okay, so this capstone vision, wait, I chose a color I already used. That cannot stand. The capstone vision has unwittingly turned marriage into an unaffordable luxury good, right? So, I mean, luxury goods, luxury beliefs, right? They're things that sociologists are increasingly talking about, right? Things that are only available to certain classes of the society, which disadvantage other classes. But I love this last part. It may sound outlandish, but he says it's not. Marriage is the social justice issue of our time, right? And I do want to make a case for this because I actually, the more I think about it, the more I find the case compelling. And as we go through, right, we're going to talk about it, especially in Melissa Kearney's two-parent privilege. And again, she's a University of Notre Dame economist who's done a whole bunch of work on how the children of married parents have so many advantages. But yeah, if only people who can marry are those who are already have made it, right, who already have status, and your kind of boundary for getting married is having achieved certain things, you leave a bunch of people out of this equation. So all of the benefits that marriage potentially might confer, shared resources being like number one, but shared time, right? Better support for children ends up getting excluded for those people. Okay, so hard right turn off of that one, but we'll get back to that question because I think it's an interesting one. Okay, Rigneris asks, is there an ideal age to marry? right? And we get this a lot, actually. I've been asked this. I've been teaching this class for a long time now, almost 10 years, or more than 10 years, more than 10 years. I started when I was a grad student, so, stuff has happened. But this is always a question that people will ask, like, is there a best age for people to get married? And I mean, generally speaking, no. Obviously, everyone's different. If you look at kind of basic sociology rules, right, and whose marriages last the best, you're probably, if you want to be super safe, your ages are somewhere between about 24 and 28 in order to get married, right? And here, right, at 24, okay, so if you get married younger than that, right, you face some of these issues, right? So of American men aged 18 to 20 who got married, almost half are divorced within 5 years. Shockingly, 18 to 20-year-old men, not that mature and maybe not ready to settle down. Who would have guessed? So they're less likely to have matured emotionally, probably less good at selecting a reliable and committed partner, right? So you're maybe making judgments more on emotion rather than, everybody makes these kinds of decisions with a lot of emotion involved, but maybe there's a little bit less rational thought behind it, right? And more driven by ooh, she pretty, which is a great criteria, but maybe not the best one for getting married. And less likely to understand, and this is probably more important than anything, how to sacrifice, communicate, and solve problems, right? So younger people are less good at it. Now, by the time you hit about 24, you're probably doing okay in most cases. I know not all people are super mature at 24, but whatever. It's probably a good point. The older you get, right, and again, lots of people get married happily and stay married after 28, but one of the things that you risk the older you get is a bit of rigidity, right? Inherently, you might start to get rigid after a certain point. You might be less able to, change your habits, right? You might get locked into your own particular habits, your own particular ways of doing things, right? Get used to being out on your own, and all sorts of things. And I know, my sister, who's single and I think has decided now that she's going to be single for life, no problems there. But one of the things she found is kind of in her mid-30s, she tried kind of, living with some different people and found it just too hard because it forced her to change her habits, right? And she had really locked into things. She loves to craft, and she needed an entire floor of her house for craft stuff. She really loves to craft, and I'm almost joking, but not quite. She has 17 different craft projects ongoing at any given time, and this did not comport well with the people that she attempted to partner with, and therefore, right, it didn't work out, right? It was well, they wanted their space too, and she just couldn't give that up, right? It couldn't be one room; it had to be half the house. Great cross stitcher, makes amazing stuff. I have one in my office. It's beautiful, but yeah, hard to get along with sometimes, I guess. Love my sister. Okay, so, this is probably our ideal range. And again, there's nothing saying that if you hit 28 or 29, you have well, I guess I'm doomed, I'm single forever, right? That's not so. But that's ideal range. You're just mature enough to make things work, but not so rigid that you can't adapt to living with another person. Okay, so themes in Harris's research, right? So what are people looking for and what kind of works in terms of marriage and when people want to get married and what works really well? Well, generally speaking, increasingly people want time to launch a career or at least acquire some financial assets, right, in preparation for marriage. Again, this is a big shift historically because in the past, right, you would have gotten married out of high school or, out of college and built your career after you got married, right? There would have been periods of probably economic deprivation for you where you were struggling, but you would have struggled together and that would have been a normal understood part. Now it's okay, now we need time to launch our careers and be ready for that. Okay, time to mature, but like I said, not too much. If you mature too much, you get moldy. No, I'm kidding. No, if you mature too much, right, you can become rigid and it becomes difficult. Now, the third one is especially for women, right? One concern that women will express much more commonly than men is the reality of kind of biology, right? And most women, though there's some indication that this is changing in the social science data, but most women still say they want to have children. The window for women to have children, unfortunately, is somewhat shorter than it is for men, right? Like peak fertility is like 15 years old, and I recommend no one has a child at 15. But if we're talking biology, peak fertility is like 15 to about 32, right? After which fertility declines considerably for women. You can still get pregnant and have kids, but you're much more likely to face complications and struggles and difficulty, getting pregnant, right? And it's just a sort of reality of biology. If anything, we're sort of biologically evolved for a fast life strategy, and we're now in a slow life strategy. Some things don't always align. Now we are seeing, and this is where things get awkward, right? I think the average age of a mother at the birth of her first child now is about 28 in Canada. So we're creeping close to the end of that, window of really high fertility for women. And that, you see this in the prevalence of reproductive technologies that have come to market for, people who are older and still trying to have children, right, up now into like their 40s, right, where people are trying to have children into their 40s because they still want children and they want a certain number of children, but time has worked and the capstone model has kind of worked against them. Okay. I haven't seen that. You missed that whole 15-minute thing I said? Okay. Yes, 24 to 28 is kind of, if we're speaking in rough terms, the ideal window to get married from a sociological perspective. You're mature enough at 24 that you're likely able to do these things, right? Communicate, sacrifice, and solve problems, and pick, you're mature emotionally and you can pick a good partner, but you're not at that point where you're getting set in your ways, if you will. Okay. So, will waiting mean fewer marriages? Okay, so Regnerus here is taking on a particular argument. There's an argument, and basically it's referred to as a tempo effect, that basically, this kind of new life pacing that we're into in sort of late modernity, right? Where we take longer to mature as individuals, right? It takes us longer to go through school, longer to establish careers, and all of that. There's an argument, it's called the tempo effect, that isn't really going to change things like marriage rates or how often people get married or what the rate of marriage per 100,000 people is. It's just going to push it later, right? Because the tempo of our lives has changed pace. We live a lot longer than we used to, right? So we don't have to hit those markers as early, but really it will have very little actual effect on marriage, right? Okay. So, what does Regnerus say? Well, he says, delay actually does seem to matter. So, for every 1 year increase in the average age at first marriage in Europe, the rate of Europeans 25 to 44 that have ever been married, right? So, this is, again, kind of an important number because you're still there, kind of young-ish, right? I guess at 44, you're into middle age, but you're not going to have a lot of marriages after age 44, right? So, there's going to be some marriages, into your 40s, but pretty uncommon. So if you haven't been married here, the chances that you're ever going to get married are relatively low, right? Especially at the top end of that range. So for every 1 year increase in the age of marriage, or the age of Europeans at the time of their first marriage, the rate of ever having been married declines 3.44%, right? Okay, and it's going to vary a little bit between different European countries, right? But, you know, the overall effects are pretty consistent, right? And here, you know, varies in age at first marriage, varies between countries from a low in Switzerland of 2.6%, right? So you see a kind of variation, 2.6 in Switzerland for every extra year at age of first marriage, to a high of the Czech Republic or Czechia, right, of 6.3. But basically, in Europe, the average is this 3.44. So results may vary, but essentially every country, for every additional year at first marriage, right, or the additional year of age at first marriage, you see increases in the rate of people who've never been married, right? Okay. South America, every year increase in the age at first marriage is associated with a 5.4% decrease in the ever married rate. So again, in Europe, it's a little bit less pronounced than it is in Latin America. The older you get in Latin America, having with your average age of first marriage, the decrease in the number or the percentage of people who've ever been married goes down. Okay. So all of this, by the way, also leads us to potential problems with fertility, right? And leads us potentially closer and closer to what demographers call a low fertility trap. Now, I'm going to say, not just for this class, get used to hearing about this. Because if I'm reading the tea leaves right, and I've sometimes, some of my past students have joked that in this class you get tomorrow's news today. I had a couple students from a couple of years ago that say, like, some of the things I told them they're starting to see in their friend groups. So I'm telling you, you're going to see more and more talk about fertility going forward, because like I said, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly in terms of academic discourses and popular discourses, within your lifetimes, fertility is going to become a major question, because what we're seeing is global declines in fertility, right? Fewer babies being born. And I was just reading an article the other day where I'm trying to remember what the actual claim was. Basically that somewhere by like 20, so you'll all be dead, so don't worry. This won't affect you as much. But by 2150, the global population might be the same as it was in 1800, right? At about 2.5-ish billion. So we might see a steep population collapse. Anyway, what can happen, right? One thing that tends to be true, people typically wait to have children until they get married, right? And so most people who never get married also never have children, right? And that is, again, not a bad thing on a moral level, but from a societal level, it can be quite devastating. And what you may end up in is what's called a low fertility trap. And a low fertility trap is a lot of things, but one of the big components of it is, as people have fewer children, there's fewer women, especially. Like, demographers always focus on women because women are more central to having children than men. There's fewer women around, right? And fewer young women in our kind of age range where women tend to have children, which again is about 15, don't have children at 15, to about 40 to 44 years old, right? After which, right, fertility is basically not 100% impossible, but close to impossible past 44. So you have, a smaller number of women in that fertile range, right? And as social norms shift towards having fewer children and more, and it comes out of South Korea, right, where somebody had, a South Korean exchange student had come over from South Korea, was living in the US. Now, South Korea, depending on who you ask, has a TFR of like either 0.83 or I've seen numbers as low as 0.63. That's children per woman, right? And if you recall, our magic number for replacement fertility is like 2.1. So 0.63 is quite a bit less than that. And they were talking about like what you do when people have a baby, right? You have a baby shower and all of this thing. And they asked the South Korean, young person, what do they do in South Korea when someone has a baby? And the South Korean person answered, I have no idea. Nobody I know has any children. And so there were just no traditions. Now, what this can lead to in a lot of ways is problems. Like even if you want to have children, it becomes harder to do so. There's less services for children. You find physical spaces are less welcoming of children in general, right? One of the things that's happened in South Korea, for example, is more and more restaurants are adult only, right? Where children are simply not welcome, right? Because it becomes a kind of social detriment to have a child. Apparently, I've not been to South Korea, but these are the things I hear, right? Where people who don't have children, instead of finding your children adorable and wonderful, are like, ugh, get them away. They're loud and noisy and I don't like them. And they're sticky for reasons that are hard to explain. So culture gets less friendly. And I'll put it this way. After my wife and I had our third kid, right, we had been living in a duplex, a 3-bedroom, right, master bedroom and 2 smaller bedrooms. And we wanted to move to a house where each kid would have their own bedroom. And it was really, really hard to find a house with 4 bedrooms, right? That was really difficult because the sort of default of builders is now, basically you have a master bedroom and then 2 kids' rooms. And the age gap between our kids is such that, we didn't think our then 8-year-old son really would want to share a room with his 1-year-old brother. So we needed, and no one can share a room with my now 16-year-old daughter. She was not 16 at the time, but trust me, she talks in her sleep. No one really wants that. So, right, the physical space sort of, made it difficult to have 3 kids, right? Really well set up for parents and 2 kids, but not so much, right? So a low fertility trap, social factors and demographic factors push people to have less children, which can lead to declining fertility and demographic kind of collapse, right? So we could get into a low fertility trap. Now, the apocalyptic part of me says, this could be really bad, and especially bad for women and women's rights, because if population starts to decline, population largely helps countries be more powerful, right? Countries with large populations tend to be economically and militarily powerful, and you could see a situation where maybe women's rights get peeled back. And that, by the way, is the plot of the very famous Margaret Atwood novel, right? The Handmaid's Tale. What precipitates the retrenchment of women's rights is a fertility crisis, right? A crisis of too few babies. So if we're being apocalyptic, right, that could happen. All right. But yeah, we could get it. Yeah, please.
I hear a lot of people now. But like, there's a lot of people that are saying that it's harder for women to have babies in general. Like our fertility rates are just statistically lower now. But is that research just due to the fact that people are older and having babies, or like are like fertility rates actually decreasing due to like an environmental?
That's an interesting question. There's, I think, some preliminary evidence that, say, like environmental toxins are potentially reducing male fertility, right? Especially there's been a pretty drastic global, well, not global because there's some places that are excluded, but a pretty standard decline in like sperm counts by about half. And lower sperm counts would be associated with more difficulties, conceiving children. But the core of the problem actually seems to be a couple of things. A, people getting married later and not wanting as many children. Those are 2 things. Getting married later and people simply not wanting as many children, right? Now, I will say, like, there's probably some kind of social things in there. A think tank in Canada, right? They're called Cardus. They do some really cool work. they did a study, and I want to say it was 3 years ago, of Canadian women, and it was about half, right, of Canadian women who were beyond kind of having children, said that they had ended up having fewer children than they had wanted, right? So if they had wanted 3 children, they had maybe 2 or 1, right? So it wasn't consistent how many children they wanted, but about half of Canadian women who were middle-aged said they had ended up having fewer children than they wanted. So I think there's a mix here. There's probably some biological things, but I think the later you start, well, okay, I mean, put in crude terms, it takes time to have children, right? And so the later you start, like if you, I don't know, you get married at 28, you probably want to be married for a couple of days before you have your first child, I'm guessing, right? So we could say probably I quit. I'm going home. Right? You probably have your first child somewhere. Haha. I wrote low enough. Between 30 and maybe 32, right? So you've had a few years with your partner. Well, and if you want to have subsequent children, right? If you want to space them out in any way, there's not that much time in those years where it's easy to have children, right? So you're going to have fewer children just by the kind of math, right? Whereas if you got married, at 24, that adds, 4 years to that kind of window where you can have children. And if you got married at like the Silence did at like 19, right, it adds again way more years to that window. So I think that definitely plays a role, right? You just can't pack that many children into such a short period of time from a physical perspective. And as you go forward in there, it gets harder and harder to have children. Plus, all those other things. Also, children are expensive. Have I mentioned I have 3? Okay, I will retire at age 95, I think, after I buy my daughter a horse. Ooh. I don't know why I did that. My screen went completely black, but it was still displaying there. And now it's back. Okay. Will that zoom like consistently? What if I write on it? No, now it doesn't work. It's the writing that breaks everything. Okay, now I have no idea what's going on. One day, friends, I will figure out how to zoom on things. This will get important later when I have a lot of charts. Okay. How's my time? Oh, so bad. All right, good times. So, back to our kind of capstone model. And I expect like 7 years from now, when everyone's talking about fertility, you have to email me and just be like, you were right. Because my ego needs this, by the way. You told us tomorrow's news today. All right, so both men and women, right, are expected to both men and women expect men to bring more resources into marriage, right? Now, combined with, and as we'll talk about through the course, a greater kind of crisis for men in terms of their ability to bring resources to relationships, this is something of a problem for marriage. And I'm not saying women should marry men without any prospects. That's not what I'm saying at all. Just that males' declining prospects, economically, definitely makes them less attractive in the marriage market, right? Because both men and women expect men to bring considerable resources into marriage. So those who can't sustain the lifestyle of both them and their partner after they get married, and especially once children come around, with some expectation that potentially the female partner, right, will not be working, are not necessarily considered marriageable. Okay. Higher lifestyle demands are being imposed on both, right? Oops, I want my pen back. Come back, Mr. Pen. Are being imposed on both, right? But it's only for men that in order to be marriage material, you need to be able to sustain a partner's lifestyle. And again, especially when little Timmy and little Tina come around, right? So I love this quote. This is like one of my favorites from the book. So I have to highlight it in green. In the capstone standard, being poor is a sign that there's something wrong with you and you're not yet marriage material, right? So you have to fix yourself before you can even be considered. Okay, Now, what Regnerus will say, and again, we'll talk about this when we talk about Kearney, more when we talk about Kearney's argument in the two-parent privilege, just because I have to keep consistent and only talk about things I haven't talked about yet. This is devastating for the poor and working class, right? Who would, in theory, benefit a lot from marriage, because marriage is that pooling of resources, right? It's that, ability to work through life's challenges together, that foundation into adulthood. They would benefit more from that than those who are already economically okay. But because the ideology of the society has turned marriage into a luxury institution, they're less likely to get married and experience those benefits, right? And marriage is very beneficial in lots of ways from a social perspective. Okay. And yeah, people have high material and psychological expectations with that capstone model of marriage. And I'll highlight the word psychological because I have it on another slide and I have the actual title. Regnerus refers to this, and he's taking it from someone else whose name I can't remember at the moment. He calls it the suffocation model of marriage, right? The idea being that you are supposed to be everything to your partner, right? You are supposed to be their best friend, their lover, right? There's emotional support system, their economic support system, and everything. And it is a heavy burden to put on people. But with the capstone model, we've come to see, right, there's both material and psychological expectations that go along with marriage that are really, really hard to meet. Okay. A foundational model or a foundation model of marriage would consider marriage as a way to reach shared goals, right, and financial stability. The capstone model says marriage is the prize for having achieved stability all on your own, which is great if you're part of that social class that can achieve stability all on your own. If you're not, you don't get to reap the benefits of marriage either. Okay, I should have cleared that comment before. Okay, so challenges. And like I said, we're going to talk a lot about men through the rest of the course. But we'll see some of the basic challenges here, right? So between 1996 and 2016, in the US, men in our kind of prime marriageable age range, right, 25 to 34, saw a huge rate or huge increase in their labor force non-participation. So men who are unemployed or not, seeking employment. And that went up from 6.7% and, virtually doubled to 11.3%. So almost like a little bit more than 1 in 10 men by 2016 were no longer, at all in the labor market, right? So they haven't at all achieved anything. So they are completely unmarriageable, right? A big no-no there, right? So 1 in 10 men in our most marriageable kind of ages is just dead no, not marriage material. Okay. So increasingly, it appears that we're in a kind of social situation, because of inflation, rises in the price of housing, and a bunch of economic factors, where we are in what Elizabeth Warren, right? So I don't know if you know who Elizabeth Warren is. She is a U.S. senator. Senator. She's a Democrat from Massachusetts. Oops, I don't know why I did that. Mass. Right, so she's a Democratic senator from Massachusetts. When she was a professor at Harvard Law School, she wrote a book called The Two-Income Trap, where she made the argument that increasingly the way modern society thinks about things has led to a situation where in order to kind of meet the material expectations of, say, this capstone model, though she doesn't use that term, basically you need both adults in families to work, which is really not ideal, especially when children are young, because it means there's increased costs for things like childcare. There's increased stress on parents as they try to balance work and domestic obligations, which again pushes fertility down. I read this really interesting paper yesterday. If you ever wonder what I do in my spare time, a lot of this. And it made the argument that, and I have to check the numbers. It was something like a 10% increase in work from home led to a 0.63 increase in fertility, right? So removing some of that strain off families, right? Allowing work from home, which didn't, and some people were being snarky about it and were like, well, of course, your employer paying you to take care of your kids. I'm like, that's not entirely it, right? Like maybe you have a grandparent that takes care of your kids, but you don't have to commute an hour a day to work, which makes it easier to have kids, right? It allowed couples to consider having additional children if they knew they were going to have a work from home option. I'm not 100% sold on the paper. I have to reread it and I have to run some of the numbers again to see if they did it correctly, because I'm arrogant and I think I can do everything better. But I found the argument kind of interesting. Okay, but yeah, this two-income trap tends to make it harder, right? If you're both working, right, you're stressed out, you're tired, but you need those two incomes, there's likely a less ability to have children, right? Two-income traps also produce some other negative economic circumstances. Two-income families tend to make housing prices rise faster than the rate of inflation, especially in the US, because what people do, they want to put their kids in good school districts. So they try to move there, and what they do, because you have more money, right, you bid up the price of housing really, really quickly. And this is what happens, say, in Boston, is as the number of two-income families increased, the price of housing shot up, which again screws up your whole housing market and makes it really difficult to ever not have a two-income family, because you can afford that big mortgage, but only if both people are working. Okay, so why don't we see more marriages, right? Clearly, two incomes are better than one, and evidence does suggest marriage is good for psychological and physical health, and it's good for both men and women. I know there's some feminist claims that it's much better for men than it is for women, but both partners benefit from marriage. Men a little bit more than women, but it's not that big of a difference. Okay, now, and here I'm going to erase some stuff because I need my picture. All right, so what does Rigneris say? Well, at some level, men, and it's still mostly men that are required to ask for marriage. Now, well, it's not impossible, right? If we go to Google Images and you look for marriage proposal, it's almost always some version of this image, right? Not that Google image search is like science or anything, but I always think Google image search is kind of an interesting barometer of social norms, because it's going to tell us what most of the images out there are. So marriage is generally still proposed by this guy or some version of him, to some version of a female partner. And increasingly, what we also see is men don't seem to want to, right? For a bunch of reasons that we're going to explore. We got 6 minutes. Okay. So we'll explore that as we go forward, because I do think it matters. And it has a lot to do with our next unit after this, which I think is sex and intimacy. We'll keep talking about this as we go through. Okay, so this is what Rigneris refers to as the suffocation model of marriage. We have really high material expectations, and this is global, right? In this study, Rigneris and his team went around the world, right? They went to Nigeria, they went to Mexico, they went to different countries in Europe, they went to Russia, which is in Europe technically, right? Asia, Africa, Latin America, the United States, all over, Lebanon, right? And everywhere, the expectations for marriage from a material perspective were really high. And few young people profess expectations of marriage that are modest. And I like this. I'll highlight it. Young adults are determined that marriage is not going to curb their premarital lifestyles, right? And this is true especially, for women who don't want their lifestyle to decline even once they have children. So that's additional pressure on male partners to have really good jobs so that they could keep that lifestyle going if their wife is now unable to work. Okay. And yeah, marriage is seen as a vehicle of self-actualization rather than a setting for self-sacrifice, right? And I will say, this is true in Regnerus's research among secular and religious people, right? Everybody seems to share this. It's widely dispersed. This is a longer version of that quote I had on the other page, that men and women have historically responded to temporarily tough economic times by delaying marriage and childbearing. And now what today's couples, highlighter, seem universally uninterested in doing, however, is lowering their material expectations. And this is a sign of our capstone standards primacy. And contrasting to our foundations model, right, being newly married and poor was difficult, expected, and typically temporary. In the capstone model, being poor is a sign there's something wrong with you and you're not yet marriage material, right? Which shifts the burden very much in the direction of men having to be super self-sustaining, or not sustaining, that's not the right word. They have to bring a lot of material resources to these relationships. That's a lot of pressure. And again, what that does is it puts a lot of pressure in the marriage market, upward, right? So the top 15% of men in terms of income, right, are going to be incredibly attractive in the marriage market. And, as you go down that scale, you're going to become much less attractive in the marriage market. So you're going to have a large number of women basically trying to attract a very small percentage of men. And again, really good for this 15% of men because they're going to have, shall we say, their pick. But for, everybody else, it's going to be difficult. And the joke is always, right, they have all those TikTok videos clowning on people who are he needs to be 6 feet, blue eyes, trust fund, right? And that's what they're looking for, right? And of course, they're making fun of these people. But I think, I remember someone putting it into Chat GPT or something and saying okay, how many men on average would that be in America that fit this description? It was something like 15, right? That are over 6 feet, have blue eyes, blonde hair, and trust fund, right? It's not a lot of people. So for those guys, right, good for them. For everybody else, not so bad, but right, or not so great. But yeah, it puts a lot of, there's a lot of people seeking that high end of the market of the mating market, right? That can support those material expectations. And a lot of people, lower down that simply are never going to meet the criteria. I thought this was going to be a less depressing unit, and I was wrong. Okay, let's stop there. Got 1 minute left, but we'll pick this up on the Monday after reading week. Men, money, and the waning motivation to marry, which is a banger. So we'll talk about that on after we come back. Okay. Have a wonderful reading week, everyone. We will see you when we all get back. I will work diligently on getting all my marking done like a good boy. Yeah, I should have that no problem. So the next person can't comment.
What is what I asked is the mother was one of those low-key crazy
Conspiracy theorists. Okay, sure.
and she's convinced that it's the fact that more people are vaccinated.
I mean, zero.
I